Tony lived in a quiet apartment above a hardware store, where the only sounds were the ticking clock and the hum of distant traffic. He was in his early 30s, tall and soft-spoken, but his eyes always carried a quiet emptiness. Days blurred into each other: wake up, work at the bookstore, return home, microwave dinner, and fall asleep to old jazz records playing in the background. He had no family nearby, and friendships had quietly withered over the years. On weekends, he often sat at a cafe, pretending to read but really just watching couples laugh, families bicker, or friends share stories. He envied them, not for what they had, but for the way they seemed seen. Tony, on the other hand, felt invisible. He had never known what it was to be truly wanted, to be chosen by someone. There was a silent ache inside him, one he couldn't name. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, only that his life felt paused, as if something, or someone, was missing. Tony met Arthur on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The bookstore was unusually quiet, and Tony was restocking shelves when a deep voice asked, "Do you have anything on antique clocks?" Turning around, Tony saw a man in his late 40s, tweed coat, silver-streaked hair, confident yet warm. Arthur had a calm presence, the kind that filled a room without trying. They chatted for a while about old timepieces, and before leaving, Arthur smiled and said, "You have an eye for detail. Ever thought of fixing clocks, not just reading about them?" That one remark sparked something in Tony. Over the next few weeks, Arthur returned, each visit growing longer, more personal. They discussed books, philosophy, loneliness, topics Tony never shared with anyone. Arthur listened, truly listened, and Tony felt seen for the first time in years. Their connection was effortless, like two pieces of an unfinished puzzle finally aligning. Arthur invited Tony for dinner one crisp Saturday evening. His house was warm, filled with the scent of roasted herbs and aged wood. Classical music played softly in the background. The dining room was elegant but cozy, with shelves lined with rare books and vintage clocks. Over wine and laughter, Tony felt a comfort he hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the food or the ambience, it was Arthur's effortless charm and the way he made Tony feel like he truly belonged, even if just for a night. Charlotte entered the room like sunlight through stained glass, soft, warm, and impossible to ignore. Tony was helping Arthur polish an old grandfather clock when she walked in, barefoot, her red hair damp from a shower, wearing one of Arthur's oversized shirts. "Oh," she said, startled but amused. "Didn't know we had company." Arthur chuckled and introduced her as his wife. Tony blinked, caught off guard. Arthur had never mentioned her. Charlotte extended her hand, her eyes curious and knowing. She was younger than Arthur, strikingly beautiful, but it was her presence that lingered. She sat with them for tea, laughing easily, teasing Arthur with affection, but her gaze kept drifting to Tony. Subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. Tony felt it, a spark, a pull he hadn't expected. He tried to ignore it, tell himself it was nothing. But something about Charlotte stirred the parts of him he thought had long been dormant. That night, as he walked home, her smile haunted him. What began as polite conversation soon slipped into something deeper, more intimate. Tony started visiting Arthur more frequently, under the pretense of helping with clock repairs or sharing books, but increasingly, it was Charlotte who occupied his thoughts. She would find small excuses to join them, bringing in coffee, asking for help with something in the kitchen, or simply lounging nearby with a book she barely read. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. She'd ask about his favorite authors, his childhood, the loneliness he tried so hard to hide, and he, without fully realizing it, began to open up. One rainy afternoon, while Arthur was out for a meeting, Charlotte invited Tony to stay and wait inside. She handed him a cup of tea and they sat across from each other in the living room. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it buzzed with a subtle energy, charged and unspoken. Charlotte leaned forward and said, almost in a whisper, "Do you ever feel like you're meant for something more, but it's just out of reach?" Tony stared at her, heart pounding. "All the time," he replied. From that day on, their interactions became more layered. A brush of the hand while passing a dish, a shared glance that lingered just a second too long, laughter that turned into quiet stares. Tony found himself memorizing the way she tilted her head when thinking, or how her voice softened when she spoke of things she loved. He noticed how unhappy she looked when Arthur wasn't watching, how the sparkle in her eyes dimmed, how she sighed a little too often. And she noticed him noticing. One evening, while Arthur was working late, Charlotte asked Tony to help her move some boxes from the attic. In the dusty, dim space, their hands accidentally touched as they reached for the same item. They froze. Her breath caught, and so did his. "Tony," she whispered, not moving away. The air between them grew heavy. He stepped back, trying to steady himself, but the line between friendship and desire had already begun to blur. They were on a path neither of them had planned, one filled with guilt, temptation, and a longing that neither could deny. It happened on a night that felt like it had been waiting for them all along. Arthur had gone out of town for a weekend conference, and Tony, as usual, was invited over, this time by Charlotte directly. She greeted him at the door wearing a soft, flowing dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile quiet but knowing. The house felt different, dimmed lights, soft jazz humming in the background, 2 glasses of wine already poured. They didn't rush. Dinner was filled with laughter, long pauses, and glances that lingered far too long. By the time the plates were cleared, the space between them felt electric. As they sat on the couch, Charlotte shifted closer, her fingers grazing his. "Tony," she said softly, almost afraid to speak the truth out loud, "I don't know what this is, but I haven't felt this alive in years." He looked at her, heart pounding, guilt already forming in the back of his mind, but it was no match for the heat building between them. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was slow, searching, filled with all the emotion they'd held back for weeks. What followed wasn't just lust, it was release, a quiet desperation wrapped in tenderness. They moved together with trembling urgency, as if trying to erase the loneliness they'd both carried for too long. That night, tangled in each other under Arthur's roof, something irreversible happened. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Arthur knew something had shifted long before he had proof. Charlotte had grown distant, distracted, her laughter less genuine. Tony's visits had become oddly timed, always when Arthur was away or busy. One night, returning early from a business trip, Arthur walked into his own home and heard quiet murmurs from upstairs. He climbed the steps slowly, each one tightening the knot in his chest. The bedroom door was ajar. What he saw shattered everything: Tony, shirtless, standing too close to Charlotte, who looked equally frozen in shock. No words were needed. The silence was deafening. Arthur turned without a sound and walked out, the weight of betrayal settling in his bones. Later, he left a note on the dining table: "Trust, once broken, doesn't return. Neither will I." Weeks passed after Arthur's departure, leaving the house cloaked in silence and shame. Tony and Charlotte barely spoke about what happened, each carrying their own guilt, unsure whether what they had was love or just the wreckage of loneliness. Then one morning, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bathtub, a pregnancy test in her hand, her fingers trembling. 2 lines. Positive. Tony stood in the doorway as she told him, her voice quiet, her eyes unsure. "I don't know what this means," she whispered, tears already welling. He knelt beside her, stunned but strangely hopeful. "Maybe it's a chance to start over, to do something right," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Over the next few weeks, they moved through a delicate hope. Charlotte smiled more, touching her stomach absent-mindedly, imagining a life where things could somehow be made whole again. Tony began to look for a new place for them, trying to build something steady amid the chaos. But at 12 weeks, everything changed. It started with a sharp pain in the middle of the night, followed by blood that refused to stop. At the hospital, the doctor's words were cold and clinical: "I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat." Charlotte went silent. She didn't cry, not immediately. She just stared at the ceiling, her face pale and expressionless. Tony held her hand, helpless, feeling her slip into a depth he couldn't reach. Back home, she withdrew completely, no more soft touches to her belly, no more conversations about baby names. She blamed herself silently, and perhaps Tony, too. The loss wasn't just of a child, but of the fragile future they'd tried to create to make their affair feel worth it. Tony tried to comfort her, to fix what he couldn't understand. But the warmth between them had faded. The pregnancy had been their last thread of purpose. And now, that too was gone. The loss fractured what little remained between Tony and Charlotte. Their home, once filled with unspoken tension and stolen warmth, turned cold, each room echoing with the silence they couldn't break. Charlotte drifted through the days like a ghost, her eyes hollow, her voice barely more than a whisper. She avoided Tony's touch, his gaze, even his presence. And Tony, guilt pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shift, didn't know how to reach her. Arguments began to surface, sharp and sudden. She accused him of trying to replace what they lost with empty promises. He accused her of shutting him out completely. But underneath it all was a deeper truth neither wanted to say: their connection had been born from something broken. Without the fantasy, the affair, or the baby, they were left only with reality, and it was unbearably bitter. One night, Charlotte finally said what Tony feared most. "I don't think I love you, Tony. I think I loved the escape." He nodded, eyes stinging, because he understood. Maybe he felt the same. By the end of that week, Tony packed his things in silence. No goodbye kiss. No dramatic ending. Just a quiet exit from a story that had unraveled, thread by thread. Tony left the city without fanfare, just a single suitcase and a worn-out heart. He didn't tell anyone, not his co-workers, not old acquaintances. There was nothing left to explain. He moved to a coastal town 2 hours away, where the air smelled of salt and the waves drowned out the noise in his head. He found a small apartment above a bakery, took a job repairing clocks in a quiet shop, and kept to himself. Each day was simple, predictable: no late-night visits, no stolen glances, no heartbreak. He walked the beach in the evenings, letting the wind peel back layers of pain. He didn't hate Charlotte or Arthur. If anything, he hated how deeply he had longed for something that was never his to begin with. Moving away wasn't about starting over, it was about learning to exist without needing someone else to complete him. And slowly, in the silence, he began to rebuild. Tony left the city without fanfare, just a single suitcase and a worn-out heart. He didn't tell anyone, not his co-workers, not old acquaintances. There was nothing left to explain. He moved to a coastal town 2 hours away, where the air smelled of salt and the waves drowned out the noise in his head. He found a small apartment above a bakery, took a job repairing clocks in a quiet shop, and kept to himself. Each day was simple, predictable: no late-night visits, no stolen glances, no heartbreak. He walked the beach in the evenings, letting the wind peel back layers of pain. He didn't hate Charlotte or Arthur. If anything, he hated how deeply he had longed for something that was never his to begin with. Moving away wasn't about starting over, it was about learning to exist without needing someone else to complete him. And slowly, in the silence, he began to rebuild. Tony stood at the edge of the pier, watching the waves roll in and out like memories, some distant, some still raw. He thought of everything that had led him here: the loneliness, the temptation, the heartbreak, and the healing. Life hadn't given him a neat resolution or a perfect ending. But it had given him something far more valuable: understanding. He realized now that people often chase others hoping to fill the emptiness within themselves. But no one else can complete you if you haven't first learned to live with who you are. Love, when built on escape, always collapses under truth, and truth, though painful, is the only foundation worth standing on. We all long for connection, for someone to see us, to choose us. But the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. You can't outrun pain or rewrite the past, but you can learn from it. You can grow. So here's the truth: don't wait for the world to fix your loneliness. Don't lose yourself trying to fit into someone else's story. Choose yourself. Heal. Begin again, not with shame, but with strength. Your story isn't over. It's just turning a page. Make sure you are the one writing it.